All set? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. I've got friends in the audience, I've got former students and other people I've talked to around town, so I appreciate you coming. I'll try to make this entertaining and informative. I'm assuming there are wide ranges of experience with this topic. There are probably people in the room who know as much as I do about it. There are probably people who go, huh, what? And I'll try to keep it at a level that makes sense to everybody. These are my bona fides. Professor of Psychology Emeritus means I've retired, but I haven't died yet. That's what that means. So, I wanted to show you this slide. Now, I wanted to kind of start with this one, but one of the problems with talking about psychedelics is you have to be careful not to freak people out, because there is a baggage to this. There's a history to it. And so I didn't want to have that be the slide you saw when you walked in, but I just like it a lot. I found it on the internet. And I can't tell you that's what the experience of psychedelics is like, but some people have said, yeah, except for the purple, you know, it's kind of like that. But let me explain how I got to be where I am. And let me tell you, my disclaimer is that yes, I'm a hippie, that's true. I had a Volkswagen bus, curtains, long hair, okay. But I was not into psychedelics. I had friends who were. I had friends who said, here, you want to try this? Handing me a handful of something. And I was like, no, I really don't. You know, nope. You go ahead, but not me. Okay, so this is not part of my history. I'm not a fanatic about it. I just ran into it a little bit later. I mentioned that part. I did teach classes for 37 years, and I have a short attention span. So I didn't want to teach the same thing all the time, so I taught, I don't know how many, I counted them at once, it was like 17 different classes or something. So I know a lot about a lot of things, or a little about a lot of things. And I have found that doing this kind of work, a lot of what I already knew really comes into play. And I'll talk about that a little bit. The way that I got into psychedelics is an interesting story. I used to take students to Jamaica when I was a professor. I'm actually doing it again this spring because I like doing that so much. And I always take books to read. Now, my wife is into meditation, and her idea of a good time is to go on a 2-week silent retreat where you don't talk to people, you don't even look at them, but you enjoy them being there, and this works very well for her, and that's a good thing. So, and I've tried that, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about it. So when I go to Jamaica, I have a lot of downtime, so I take a book to read. And I got a book, a very thin book, called Buddhism Plain and Simple, which is about meditation. And I thought, I'm going to read that book 3 or 4 times, and I'm going to know more about this. And when I was in the Miami bookstore, there's a book back here on the table by Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind. Now, I had read a few things by Michael Pollan, and I liked him. He's a scientific writer. So I just got the book. I didn't know what the book was about. I just thought, this will be good. Okay, now I got 2 books, okay? So I go to Jamaica, I'm reading the Buddhism book, and again, I've got a short attention span. So I read this book, and then I put it down and read this book, and I go back and forth, back and forth. And I get about halfway through. And what I noticed, completely on my own, was that when they're talking about meditation and the experience of deep meditation, if you've done this for a long time, you know, like heavy duty meditation, when they talk about what that's like, and what Pollan was talking about in his book, which turned out to be about psychedelics, they use the same phrases. And I noticed this myself. I said, they're using the same phrases. And I kind of went, click, they're talking about the same thing. At least not complete overlap, but some of the same mind space if you want to look at it that way. And Pollan later on in his book talks about exactly that, because he talks about brain studies of people who are meditating and people who are on psychedelics and the similarities in what the brain seems to be doing. So that's pretty well established that they do sort of the same things. Now again, there are a lot of ways to think about this, and one way to think about it is, okay, I could meditate for 30 years, or I could take some psychedelics and have perhaps somewhat the same experience, okay? So anyway, that's one of the thoughts I had. The other thing that Pollan talked about in his book, though, which is really why we're here, is he talked about the history of using psychedelics in therapy. And I had to confess, I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know that psychologists had done that. So I was really, and what he said was, it seems to work pretty well, actually, and we'll be talking about that a bit. So I got more interested. I came back and I looked up, actually I typed in psychonaut, which is what people in the psychedelic field call themselves, not astronauts, but psychonauts. Psychonauts, Wisconsin. And the Madison Psychedelic Society popped up. So I went to a couple of meetings. I met an elder who had been involved in this movement for a long time, another psychologist actually, and got to know him. And that sort of got me started. Then I thought, well, I need some training in this. Okay, if I'm going to do this kind of therapy or even learn more about it, I need to get some training. I looked around. There's a school, the California Institute for Integral Studies. All their classes were full. And I thought, okay, let me just do an internet search. And I found a group called Fluence, which it turns out to be one of the very best training groups that there is. And I was able to get into that. So I've done some training with that. I have certificates in psychedelic harm reduction and integration and in ketamine assisted psychotherapy. So I've got nice, shiny certificates that are worth the paper that they're printed on, except they do represent the amount of training I got. Okay, so they're not licenses in themselves, but. And then I got involved in some clinical trials at UW-Madison. Clinical trials are trials where they're testing the effectiveness of any medication. And there are three phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is it safe? Is it going to hurt people? And if they find that it's not going to hurt people, then phase 2 is, does it help? Does it seem to help any kind of issue? And then phase 3 is, if it turns out that phase 2, the results are that it does help, phase 3 is, okay, how much? How much do you need? So phase 3 studies are varying the amounts that you get of whatever that medicine is. And that's where most of the psychedelic research is these days, is in phase 3. So at UW-Madison, I'm on two teams there. I'm on a psilocybin and methamphetamine abuse team, where people have psilocybin, and they have, I'll go over this a little bit later, but it's not just that you come in and get psilocybin, you get therapy along with it. You have 3 prep sessions, you have a psilocybin session, another 2 therapy sessions, another psilocybin session, and then 3 more therapy sessions. So there's actually a lot of therapy involved. The catch is, if you're in the study, they have 3 conditions: high levels of psilocybin, moderate levels, and really tiny levels. And you're not going to know what you're going to get. So you can't go there expecting to have a certain kind of experience because you may be in that other condition. And even the therapy that's done with clinical trials is a little bit different because everybody has to do the same thing. So the therapy is not as creative as other types of therapy are, but those are clinical trials. And that's one of the ones I'm involved in. The other is in 5-MeO-DMT. I'm going to talk about all these psychedelics a little bit later. And this one is with treatment-resistant depression. And those are just about to start up. So if you're curious about this, I don't have it on the slide, but if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it'll tell you all the clinical trials going on in the country, and there are a lot of them. And some of them are targeted for depression or trauma or whatever, and some are for what they call healthy volunteers, which means anybody can do it. But of course, they're all over the country. So I did that, and I currently have a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy practice outside of town at my cabin, and I'll tell you more about that at the end. So I have gotten that far. Okay, please, if you have any questions at any time, there'll be some time at the end for that too, but just raise your hand and let me know. So here's what I want to talk about. What is the history? Should they be treated as Schedule I drugs? Schedule I drugs mean illegal. Illegal, can't touch it. You might wonder, okay, clinical trials get waivers for this, so it's legal within the clinical trial world, but not in the other parts of the world if you're a Schedule I drug. How effective are psychedelics and how do they work? We'll talk about that a little bit. And then what does therapy with psychedelics actually look like? Okay. So, the history of psychedelics and therapy. Now, the history of the use of psychedelics goes back thousands of years because indigenous people have used different kinds of psychedelics all around the world for different kinds of reasons, largely for what we might call enlightenment. So there's a long history of the use of psychedelics for those kinds of reasons. In Western therapy, they've only been used since the 1960s. And what happened was basically when LSD came out, some psychologists said, okay, that looks interesting. I wonder what it would be like to do therapy with it. So they weren't doing this in necessarily an organized way. There were a lot of case study reports, but the report was that they actually worked very well, okay, at a clinical level. So therapists started using it a lot, and again, there were a lot of reports. Some of the books back here on the back table have some things about that, and it's not hard to find those reports. They're anecdotal again. These were not experimental studies for those of you who have a good scientific background, but a series of anecdotes. And then what happened is, it all went away. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but basically, if I have a big party and I invite 1,000 people, and I put LSD in the punch bowl. How much did I put in? Who knows? How much did you get? Who knows? Who knows who you are? Who knows what kind of issues you're dealing with? Under those kind of conditions, if I have a party where 1,000 people come, about 3 of them are going to wind up in the hospital, okay? Because they shouldn't have done it to start with, and we'll talk about that. But if that happens a few times, guess what the reports in the newspapers are? And next thing you know, LSD was described as being public enemy number 1 at some point, okay? Which is interesting, and we'll talk about that again, because actually it's a fairly innocuous thing. But in 1971, this was declared a Schedule I drug. And quite a few therapists simply kept using it. They just thought they believed in it, and they just kept doing it. And imagine doing this when every client you deal with could be the end of your career. Because all you have to do is go tell somebody, and next thing you know, you're in trouble and you lose your license. So, in other words, people really cared about doing it. Now, I'm skipping ahead a lot, but about 15 years ago, research started back up again, because there were those whispers of this used to really work, people. Okay, can we just not do this, or should we do it anyway, or should we find a way? And it's interesting that the first series of studies that was done were with people who were terminally ill. And you can imagine the reasoning here. Okay, you're not really going to hurt them because they're going to die anyway, so go ahead and use LSD with them. And they did, and they found that people reported very positive effects. One of the classic effects is your fear of death seems to go away. And a lot of people reported that. They reported being more at peace with existence in general, with, in other words, highly positive effects, very profound effects. And that was kind of the beginning of what you might call a renaissance. Now, it hasn't been a smooth thing. And if you've been paying attention to the news, MDMA just got turned down by the FDA. And this may come up again later, but that was kind of a big deal, because what people were expecting was that MDMA was going to be approved, and that was going to pave the way for other things. Since that didn't get approved, it's not quite clear what's going to happen. And that may be re-examined again, but there's a lot going on, in other words. Now, I did want to point out some difference between this sort of recreational use and clinical use. Now, I've already alluded to this. So in recreational use, you have unknown dose and purity. I often have people say, well, I had mushrooms once, and I'll say, well, how much did you have? And they'll say, well, it was 2. How big were it? Well, they were kind of big. Okay, in other words, I don't know. I don't know what that was, or I drank some tea or whatever. I don't know how much I got, okay? Whereas in clinical use, there's a controlled dose and purity. So we're very careful with this. We know what we're using, and we know exactly how much we're using, and we're probably going to calibrate it with your body weight, although it doesn't seem to matter for some of the psychedelics. Environment controlled or not. You're at a party. The environment is pretty much uncontrolled. It may even be chaotic. Maybe you're at a concert, okay? Or you're in a controlled and positive environment, what we call in the field the container. My job is to create a safe container for you. A nice environment, nice music, I'm trained in first aid, never had to use that, and don't expect to ever have to use it, but this environment is going to be kind of nice. It's not chaotic. Support systems, uncertain or not. Is somebody looking after you at that party? Did you tell somebody to look after you? Are they still looking? You know. Okay, now I'm going to be looking at you. I'm going to be not staring at you, but you know, I'm going to be there the whole time. In the psilocybin trials at UW-Madison, there are actually 2 professionals in the room the whole time, and we're watching you, and we're taking care of you. So nothing's going to happen that we're not going to see. Okay. Screening for potential danger. Okay, now Jason.
Yes, sir.
Jason happens to have schizophrenia. His thinking, I'm making this up.
Oh, yes.
We spent 3 weeks traveling together in Nepal, so if I would know if he had those kinds of issues. But let's just pretend he does. Okay, Jason's thinking is too loose. I would say if he came to me to do psychedelics, I'd say, you shouldn't do this. It's probably going to be okay. Actually, the results are a little bit ambiguous about that. It doesn't seem to be a bad idea, but it's not as clearly a good idea as it is for other people. So if I do screening, I don't give it to Jason. Now, at the party, of course, nobody says, hey, should you be doing this? So there's no screening there. But it's an important part of it. And of course, if his blood pressure is too high, the nurse practitioner is going to pick that up. Because what ketamine will do, for example, it's kind of like walking up a flight of stairs. It's going to raise your blood pressure a little bit, heart rate a little bit, so that might be important for some people, okay? And we know that kind of thing, so the screening is very important for the clinical work. Recreationally, nobody's going to help you process anything either, because that's not part of the process. Whereas in the therapeutic situation, in the clinical setting, that's a very large part of the process, is let me help you process this. I will not tell you what anything means. I'm not going to interpret anything for you, but I'm going to say, can you tell me more about that? And I might say, how did that feel in your body? Because we want to get away from the intellectual experience. Psychedelic experience takes a lot of different forms, and a good therapist can help you talk about all of that. So you have that person doing that in the clinical work, and you don't have it in the recreational work. Okay, so the effectiveness, I'm going to sort of generalize here. They work 2 to 3 times better than any other medicine that you can take. I'm comparing them to antidepressants and things like that. Now, I want to take this apart a little bit. 2 to 3 times better, does that mean it helps everybody? No, 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 no. Does it mean we can tell you how much it's going to help? Nope. Can we tell you if it's going to help? Nope. We can't do that either. But it does seem to work 2 or 3 times better than any other thing that you can put in your body. The common report for people is that they have a year's therapy progress in 1 session. If you've ever had therapy, you know it's very hard to change patterns in your life. You can work at it really hard, you can make progress. The reports here are that the progress comes much more quickly, often during the session itself. And I've seen that happen myself in the work that I've done. It's been called the first new medicine in 50 years. And that's factually true. The antidepressants we take are all about 50 years old. We know what they do, we know what they don't do. When I taught courses on this, it was pretty clear that antidepressants, it's hard to find good evidence that they work better than placebos, particularly if the placebos are what we call active placebos. That is, you feel something, so you feel like you've taken something. Now, let me say very quickly, if you're on antidepressants and they're working for you, that's great, because they work for some people. So certainly don't go off of them. But in terms of the experimental results, they're not very strong. And they've all we've had for the last 50 years. So there is some optimism about using psychedelics in that way. Hours instead of weeks. During the session itself, I'll talk about the sequence in a little while. The idea is that, well, I'll go to the next slide. And there are a few side effects, and the side effects are typically felt during the session, and they're the psychedelic effect. They're the idea that my mind is doing unusual things. It's not high anxiety, it's not those kind of things. It's just during the session, you're traveling. And for some people, that's a little uncomfortable. So This is a chart I got 2 years ago from a friend of mine who does research at the University of Minnesota. By the way, I've got some handouts here that have some of these slides on them. It's got this one if you want to take one home, because it's a lot to look at all at once. Ayahuasca, if you look at the solid lines, these are published evidence in humans. Ayahuasca has been used for addiction. It's an unusual thing, sort of counterintuitive to some people, that psychedelics work very well for the treatment of addiction. Now keep in mind here, you're talking about a single dose. This is not something that you take every day. So it's not conducive to addiction, really. And I've got another slide on that. But you can see the different levels of results here. Ketamine is here, MDMA. I'm going to go over all of these in just a few minutes individually, but basically the idea is there's actually a lot of evidence here that these help a variety of conditions. Okay, and again, I've got this on a handout if you want to look at it. Now, the typical effects, it's important to keep in mind that psychedelics are not all doing the same thing. Psilocybin and LSD are mostly working on serotonin. And the different ones work on different neurotransmitters. Let's see, ketamine works on glutamate. So they're not doing exactly the same thing in the body, but they seem to do sort of the same thing in the mind. You do get more acceptance of mortality, and you get a loosened thinking. I forgot to bring my prop. I've got a little snow globe. And this is my sort of metaphor for what ketamine or what the other psychedelics do. You've gotten into a pattern that's not quite working, and what these do is sort of turn the snow globe over. And now everything's in the air or in the water, and it settles again. And if you have the idea that the mind has healing properties the way the body does, it settles a little better. And that's really the whole idea. And they all seem to work about that way. And I'm going to give you my opinion on this. I have not seen any evidence that any particular psychedelics work any better than any others, with the exception of ibogaine. So at this point, I think they're all working by the same process. I think that's about all we know. You can talk about neurotransmitters and neurons branching out more. There's some evidence for that in mice. We just don't have the evidence for humans at this point. So we don't really know how these things work. But again, the effect is to loosen up your thinking. You're a little bit better able to get unstuck. You may have new perspectives and insights that stay with you afterwards. I'll give you an example. The first time I took ketamine, I went into it with the idea of having a better understanding of my relationship with my parents. It wasn't bad. I didn't have a bad childhood, but I think I felt kind of not understood. You know, I felt a little, I don't know, unusual or something. So I went into this with that in mind. And at some point, when I was coming out of the ketamine, the person I was working with, Justin Lubin, you'll see his name in a minute, we had decided he was going to drop in the idea of my parents. Okay, so Joe, for the next song, think about your parents and see what comes up. And we call that dropping something in, okay? And as I thought about it, I felt a feeling of love. I felt loved. And my thought was, my parents loved me without understanding me. And in my mind at that time, that was good. I was like, way to go, parents. Okay, you didn't understand me, but you loved me anyway. Okay, I still have that feeling and I still have that thought. So this is real to me. It's not groundbreaking, earth-shaking, but I didn't have that thought before I did the ketamine. And now that's part of the way I look at my parents, okay? So you get to keep things. And again, this acts during the session itself and shortly thereafter. We think about 48 hours of flexibility, where new thinking patterns can be sort of put in place and changes can be made. So, now the next question is, are they safe? And we're kind of getting into the Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 things. Recreational use can present a lot of problems. Like I said, you don't know what you're getting, you don't know how much, you don't know what the environment, I don't know who you are, all those kinds of things. Clinical use is different. Right now they're treated as Schedule 1 drugs. Schedule 1 drugs are things that have high addiction danger and no benefit, okay? So the question is whether these substances, and we call them medicines, have that kind of effect. Okay, here's a nice chart. I've got this in the handout too. If you look here, this is the tendency to become addicted, very low to very high. Okay, so highly addicted, that's heroin, okay? Active dose to lethal dose, your possibility of overdose, actually killing yourself. Okay, heroin has 0.2, which means if you accidentally take 5 times more than you wanted to, you can die. And a lot of us have friends who have died. Okay, it's not hard to do. You only have to miss it. I mean, it may seem like a factor of 5 is a lot, but it's actually not. Okay. Now, you've got a lot of different drugs here. You got alcohol, which of course is legal, is way out here. MDMA is here. Look at the bottom left. Look at the 2 safest ones. Oh, look, LSD and psilocybin, which is the mushroom stuff. So these, they're not addictive, and you pretty much can't hurt yourself with them. You can't take that much. So if you were just looking at this and saying, okay, which one should be Schedule 1 and which one shouldn't be, you would never pick these to be Schedule 1. There's a lot of baggage here. There's a lot of cultural baggage. And you know, again, there's talk, and these may be legal sometime soon, and they are legal in some states already. But you know, anyway, this is a very, and you'll notice ketamine is here. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, ketamine is actually it's a sedative, and they use it in anesthesia. So what they're talking about here is a higher dose than we would use clinically for psychedelic therapy. But it does have an addiction potential, and you can hurt yourself with it. So, should they be Schedule 1? Not based on the evidence. What I think many people are hoping for is Schedule 3, which means it's legal with a prescription. And that's how ketamine is right now, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. Oh, so here are the psychedelics that are commonly talked about. MDMA is treated as an empathogen. This is the one they're using a lot for trauma these days. It seems to give people a sense of safety to the point that they can talk about anything, even that terrible thing that happened. They're comfortable enough to talk about it. It's used in couples therapy. And it seems to be quite effective. It was turned down by the FDA. One of the reasons here is it's very hard to do research on this. Okay, I'll use the 2 of you. You're in the control condition. You've gotten LSD. You're pretty sure you're in the control condition. You're pretty sure you've got LSD. Okay, so it's hard to mask this. What I would like is for you both to have no idea which condition you're in, but that's really hard to do, and it's hard to do with any of these. So one of the criticisms then is, well, okay, so you told me you felt better, but is that because you expected to feel better because you're having that effect, or is it because the medicine really helped, and you can't really disentangle that? So part of it is just experimental. It's just a problem with that. Okay, LSD, I think most people are familiar with. What I kind of want you to notice here is the onset and the peak, because there are massively different amounts of time here. Psilocybin, ketamine has an asterisk because it's legal with prescription. Ayahuasca, ibogaine, which is more from Africa. 5-MeO-DMT. 5-MeO-DMT is also called the toad. They used to get it from a toad in northern Mexico. They don't do that anymore. The toads are happier. They make it synthetically. This one has exclamation marks because it's been called the Everest of psychedelics. For many people, they can kind of resist the effects of some of the psychedelics and kind of sort of not try to go too far away. Apparently with 5-MeO-DMT, that's just not going to happen. You're just going to be gone. And you're only going to be gone for about 30 minutes, although to you, apparently, time doesn't exist while you're in that state. I've never had that experience yet. But
it's so fast, 1 minute. You're there.
That's what I hear. That's what I hear. Yeah. Now, question for you. If these all work the same, let's just imagine for a moment they're all equally clinically effective. Which one would you use?
One that can end before your session's up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the joke in the psychedelic field is that you can use LSD, but you're going to miss lunch and dinner. Okay? You can use psilocybin, and you're going to miss lunch, but you can make dinner. Okay? Okay? 5-MeO-DMT, you can run 5 people in a day if you want to. Okay? So part of it is simply practical. Oh, and by the way, I'm running these clinical things, so I have to pay therapists. When I did a psilocybin trial, I spent 8 hours watching a person on a couch. Didn't do much. She had to go pee a couple of times, and that was about it. And we talked some at the end of it, but for a long time, it's just like, nothing happening here. You know? But I got paid for it. Okay, so again, there's money involved. No big surprise there. So ibogaine, which I mentioned is from Africa, this one, 18 to 36 hours. And apparently it's pretty intense the whole time. Seems to be really clinically effective, but you have to be willing to do that. And of course it's illegal too, although in Mexico it's apparently not. And things are kind of happening around the world. Right? And these are all, I don't think this is on the handout. Okay, why I like to use ketamine. When I first got trained at Fluence, I thought, okay, this is all interesting stuff, but how am I going to do this? Because it's actually illegal. And maybe it's going to be legal someday, maybe, okay, but right now it's not. And I had this vision of the sheriff driving up in my driveway. And I didn't want to see that. And my wife said, I don't want to visit you in prison. So I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. But then I heard about ketamine, and the thing I heard about ketamine was that it's legal. And I was like, well, why are we talking about all this other stuff then? And there are some reasons for that I'll get to in a minute. But I like to use it because first, it's safe. The history of ketamine is that it's been used as an anesthetic around the world for 50 years. And it's been used a lot. It was used a lot in Vietnam. It's a very safe, again, it raises blood pressure just a little bit, but other than that, it's really a safe thing to use. And that's the first question we always ask. It's cheap. It doesn't actually cost much. The medicine for one of my sessions cost about 25, 30 bucks, okay? There's not even a lot of money to be made with this, which is not true for some of the other psychedelics. People are hoping to patent things and make a lot of money. And that was also part of the problem with the MDMA trials. They may have cut corners because they were trying to get it approved so they could make a lot of money off this, okay? And with ketamine, that's not much of an issue. However, there is something called S-ketamine that has been patented. They reversed a molecule, and they called it something new. And this fits within sort of the American medical system where it's really expensive, but your insurance might cover most of it. So there's still a lot of money changing hands. It's just not necessarily yours. And it's the only one that is FDA approved for treatment-resistant depression. So it is approved for that, so insurance will cover it. Ketamine is a Schedule III drug. It's legal with a prescription. It's prescribed off-label. That is, it's not FDA approved for the treatment of trauma, but you can write a prescription if you're a medical practitioner, and it's off-label, which about 20% of all prescriptions are. So it's not something unusual, but it's perfectly legal like that. It doesn't carry the baggage of other psychedelics. If you use the word psychedelic around some people, they kind of, psychedelic, you're using psychedelics, and it's like, ketamine is really an analgesic. They call it a dissociative. And one of the things they noticed about it was that when they were using it as an anesthetic, they could fix your knee, and if you were depressed before, you might not be depressed anymore. And that happened often enough that people noticed it. And they found that, okay, in the anesthetic dose like this, it's safe. We use it in about 1/14 the dose that you'd use for anesthesia. So if it's safe at this level, it's even safer at this level. So that's how that works. Requires less time than do most of the other psychedelics, not 5-MeO-DMT, but the sessions I run are usually 70 minutes from start to finish as far as the medicine goes. Now the session itself is 3 hours because we spend some time talking, and we've already talked before, but we don't just jump into it, and then we're talking afterwards as well, so I always plan for about 3 hours. But still, only 70 minutes of that is actually ketamine. And that goes by pretty quickly. So, What does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy look like? First of all, there are different modes of administration. You can go to Appleton, there's a ketamine clinic, they'll give you an IV, and nobody will really talk to you. So it's treated as a medical event. It's not a therapeutic event. You may get something out of it, and people often do, but that's not really, the talking is not really part of it. Troches, these are things you put in your mouth. Typically you don't swallow them, you just swish them around, and that's what I use. And IM is intramuscular. You can also do an injection. These are a little different. If you're doing an IV, you're getting a fairly constant low dose at any given moment. If you're doing the IM, you're getting it all at once. And if you're doing the troche in your mouth, it's being absorbed by your gum levels, and you're getting it gradually over time. But we actually do 2 doses, but those are different ways of giving it. So if you were going to do this, the first thing you do is you talk to a nurse practitioner to get medically cleared, and they do the prescribing. If I'm doing this with you, I would do a preparation session that usually takes 1 to 2 hours, usually closer to 2. I like to get to know you a little bit. I usually do a values exercise just to help you clarify what your values are and to kind of put you in a good state of mind as you get ready to have the experience itself. The dosing session, I use troches. This is a tablet that's dissolved in your mouth and swished. The taste has been described in different ways. I think if it was a drink, you probably wouldn't order it. You know, it's not pleasant, but it's tolerable is what people tell me, and I've had it myself, and that was my experience of it. The session consists of 2 doses that total about 300 to 400 milligrams. Now, I want to be exact about this. This is how much the tablets are. Well, there's about a 20% bioavailability, which means you're only getting about 20% of that in terms of ketamine. So you're not getting that much ketamine. You're just getting that much of a tablet. And as I said, it lasts about 70 minutes, followed by about an hour of processing. So we talk about that. And then there's an integration session within 48 hours. So it's a 1, 2, 3. Prep session, dosing session, integration. And in integration, what we're going to do is talk about how this relates to your life, how you can maintain any changes you would like to make, and what else you got out of this. Sometimes something else occurs to you, sometimes even during dreams. The point is you're in that sort of malleable state of mind for about 48 hours after the session. Now, excuse me, at that point, we're done. Now, you can have another session if you want to, but that's going to be weeks later. And different clinics do it different ways. What I found is that in some clinics, if you go in, they have you sign up for 6 doses, and you might do it every other day. You might do it once a week. There seem to be no real rules about this. There's no research on what really works better. I've talked to people about it, and what they tell me is, well, I've done this, and this is what happened. And the phrase, the Wild West, has been used a few times, where there's just not a lot of research on the exact way of doing this. Again, it's a safe medicine, no matter how you use it, apparently, but there is a little bit of blur about how to do it. I myself would prefer to do fewer sessions. I've had people come back for 2, sometimes 3, but you know, if you want to just do 1, that's fine with me. And I don't push for that second session. This is where I do it. This is my little cabin out in the country. And this is the porch where in warm weather we do it out there. And in cold weather we do it inside, and that's my chair, and I can lie you back in that. And if you'd rather be on the couch, that's fine too, okay? We'll do it any way that you want to do it. We play music, and it's a peaceful kind of thing. And if you were curious about this and you wanted to get started, there's a company called Perspective Wellness down in Milwaukee. This is run by Justin Lubin. I ran into him at a psychedelic conference. He told me he had the cheapest ketamine clinic in the country, and I think that's true. His priority is access, and that's my priority as well. If you want to work with me, or if you have questions, you can email me there or call me there. If you go to perspectivewellness.org and look under Teams, you'll find me there, and there's a link there that you can use to come in with me. If you just come in through Perspective Wellness, you're working with Justin instead of me. So if you want me, you have to click on that link. And the cost, it's $90 for the nurse practitioner, it's $30 for the medicine. I charge $500 for the prep, dosing, and the integration session. It's about 6 hours of my time. I feel different ways about this. I'll tell you one way that I feel. I had somebody come and work on my dishwasher. He charged me $85 an hour to do that. It was worth it to me. It fixed my dishwasher, okay? So I charge about 90, 100 bucks an hour, okay? So that's pretty close. And what I would say to somebody is, okay, if you've got your usual bills and you pay your usual bills, and you know, if you messed up your car and you had a $500 deductible but the car was still drivable, would you get the car fixed? Would you pay the 500 bucks? And if you would, then I'd say, well, then prioritize your mental health, okay? Be willing to spend money on your mental health. Now, at the same time, people who are depressed are often not doing very well. And I simply say, if you can't afford that, tell me what you can afford. If you can't afford anything, I'll do you for nothing. And about half the clients I've run so far have not paid anything. So the thing to me is access. I'm very fortunate compared to a lot of my colleagues that work in this field. I'm a retired professor. I've got some retirement income. I don't need this to pay my mortgage. Okay, I think my time is worth something. Yes, I do. But at the same time, I'm more interested in trying to help people than I am with trying to get any money out of this. So again, about half my clients have been pro bono at this point. And you can go down to Milwaukee and work with Justin. He's a little cheaper than I am. He's not a psychologist, okay? He's not a therapist, but he will have you have that experience, and he's very good at it. So, okay, that's it. Questions or comments? Yes?
Considering Wisconsin has been pretty behind on legalizing even like medical marijuana, do you see a future for psychedelics in Wisconsin specifically, just with kind of how behind we are from the rest of the country on these things?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is yes. I see a future. How far away is it? That's another question. And typically, nationally, what happens is red states are behind blue states on this. It seems to be sort of a political thing, that the blue states are more likely to legalize things. Wisconsin doesn't even have legalized marijuana for medical reasons at this point. And what has been used as an argument, though, and I thought it was going to be more successful than it's turned out to be, everybody cares about veterans. And veterans have a lot of PTSD, and the psychedelics really seem to help that. So it looked like for a while, everybody was going to sort of get behind this. It wasn't going to matter so much about the politics, but I don't think that's really materialized yet. So I think it's going to happen. The question is, when's it going to happen? And I'm a little further down the time trail than some people are, so I'm more concerned about what I can do now, and I'm glad ketamine is there. And of course, it's there simply accidentally. I mean, it just happens to be a Schedule III drug. And it just happens to have effects that are like psychedelics. So we can use that, so I'm happy using that right now. I think the field will benefit if we can get more things out there, although again, I haven't seen the evidence that anything works better than anything else. I've met plenty of people who think that, but I haven't seen any kind of experimental evidence that really says we should be focusing on this one, because with the exception maybe of MDMA, because MDMA does seem to help with trauma more than the other psychedelics do, but that's about the only exception I can name. That and ibogaine, but that just takes so long that, you know, I'm not sure how feasible that is. Other questions? Yes?
Is there an ego reset quote with ketamine that they claim with the psilocybin or the LSD?
Okay, so
And if you can explain that.
yeah, I can try. A lot of people report experiences with psilocybin and LSD that are, they report experiences that are called something like ego death. You just lose yourself, you're just gone, and you're off in the universe somewhere. In ketamine therapy, that's called leaving the room. And I think the doses in the ketamine session are lower comparatively. You can't really compare LSD to ketamine milligram by milligram because LSD is so powerful. But it looks like the doses that are used clinically are lower than the ones people use for enlightenment. So you do get reports like that with ketamine, but I think you get fewer of them. Okay? I've had 2 ketamine experiences myself for what that's worth. I did feel that leaving the room thing, but not as intensely as Okay. When I started doing this kind of work, I was told by the trainers, okay, if you're going to do this kind of work, you need to have the experiences. So I've had a couple of psilocybin experiences. They were very different from ketamine. Ketamine to me is more benign. I haven't had people have any kind of real problems with it, whereas psilocybin can throw you all over the place. You know, it can be very helpful, but it may not be particularly pleasant, you know, for some people.
Is that effect being studied?
It's being reported.
Being reported?
It's being reported.
There's no data information on that.
The psilocybin clinical trials are still dealing with what I would say are moderate levels of psilocybin. There are very few reports of any problems in those studies. Okay? I mean, like 2 or 3 reports out of 1,000 subjects, and there it's mostly just simple discomfort. You know? So, but I do think the level of dose is important, and sometimes when people do it recreationally, which might be very thoughtful. It may not be at a party. It might be at my house, okay? They are taking heavier doses sometimes. There does seem to be, in the research, an association between benefit and metaphysical experience. So the more intense, the more out there the experience is, the more benefit there seems to be to it. And these are from the phase 3 studies where they vary the amount. You get the biggest benefits in the highest dose condition, typically. Other questions? Yes, Bobby.
It seems to be a stigma within the field of psychedelics for therapy. How can we encourage our clients to move closer to this topic?
I think it's a really good question. How do we get people to be more comfortable with this? And I've certainly run into this myself because I've spoken to some professionals and even their reaction was somewhat, you know, sort of wide-eyed. What the field has tried to do, they've tried to do a couple of things. They've tried to focus on the data and say, look, this really helps people. One of the really interesting areas of research is with suicide. And this surprised me when I first saw it, but psychedelics seem to really help people who are suicidal. And they seem to actually pull them out of it during the session. Okay? There's no guarantee they're not going to go back in, but people who are suicidal simply say, I don't feel that way anymore. You know, and that's pretty powerful. Okay? So I think seeing examples of that might be a good thing to show people. But it's very different. My experience has been it's very different in different parts of the country. On the East Coast, this is pretty well known, and you know, West Coast too, for that matter. Midwest, not so much. You know, and we're often a little behind some of the cutting edge things. But so I think it's been a little bit careful. It's been interesting here. This is the first public talk that I've given on this, and I've been kind of slow about it, and that was okay. And I've wondered how to bring it up that doesn't freak people out. But it's one of the concerns. I don't have a complete answer to it, but that's the best I can do. Yes?
Well, you know me a little bit, but if I end up going somewhere you don't want to go, you just have to tell me, because.
Okay.
Right. The easy question is, the first question is an easy one. Is there any evidence, I mean, I've never been in combat, but is there evidence that psychedelics would help PTSD?
Absolutely. There's clear evidence of that. Now let's keep in mind what that means. It doesn't mean it helps everybody. It means compared to not using psychedelics, it produces a cure rate that is between 30 and 50%. Okay. So there is data on that. Okay, that's your first question.
Well, the other, I guess, well, I have the term mental health. Whenever I hear people talk about mental health, my first thought is, are these the people that think that 67 minus 34 equals 15? Because it seems to me what we're really talking about are people's emotions. not your mind, well, I understand your mind and your emotions all work together, but it seems more like we're talking about dealing with people's emotions.
I think that's true.
And I know how to be depressed, and I don't know where, I mean, I've never heard voices, and I don't think
Mhm.
I don't think I'm schizophrenic or things like that.
Mhm.
But I do, and now that I'm older and I don't have to go to work every day, I can be more honest. What's wrong with being depressed anyway? I mean, there are times when I say to myself, you know, being depressed and feeling sorry for myself are one of the great pleasures of life.
Well, I
I
understand
mean,
that.
I'm not that
understand
way
that.
every day,
Yeah,
but there are times, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, let me try to frame an answer to that. I think it's important to be able to sit with our emotions. And the idea that we're going to be happy all the time, that's not going to happen. And I think negative emotions provide flavor to life, right? Now, in my experience, teaching for a long time, I've had a lot of students, and because I taught courses about this kind of thing, and usually had students write journals, I got to know people pretty well. And I've certainly had students over the years who were very depressed. Not depressed in a way that was interesting to them in any kind of way, but depressed in a way that was just flattening, where they couldn't get out of bed, couldn't do anything, couldn't feel pleasure in any kind of way. And that's what I think of as clinical depression, okay? I mean, I can say I've been depressed, but it's hard to imagine how some people feel. And I think those levels of depression are what we would typically call dysfunctional. That is, your life doesn't work if you're that depressed. You can't go to work, you can't go to class, whatever the thing is, and you just experience no joy in the world. And I think people like that, it's important to help them if we can, so they don't have to feel that bad. Right? And the psychedelics do seem to do that. Now again, not for everybody, not every time, but if we make the decision that those kind of people ought to be helped, then the question becomes, what's the best way to help them? And there's not a single answer. We can support them if they're a family member. We can love them, okay? But if we have a way of pulling them out of that pit, I think it's worth trying it. And this does seem to be one sort of new way, I'm using quotation marks here because it's been around since the 1960s, that does seem to have those effects for a lot of people. I don't want to go too much into my own personal experiences with clients, but I have worked with clients who are very depressed, and I have seen them come out of it during the session. Now, the difficulty there is I may have a life, if I'm a client who's depressed, I may have a life that is formed around my depression, and if my depression is gone, my life is still in the same form. So I may have to change parts of my life to be able to keep the depression away. But even the ability to be without it for a little while, I've seen be highly valued by people.
Is anybody else gonna talk?
If you have a follow-up, go ahead.
Well, yeah, do you have to be, does lithium have to be prescribed?
Lithium does, yeah.
Okay, well then I was prescribed lithium once,
Okay.
and I took it, and I remember I was driving on the road, and I was going around this big looping curve, and I remember thinking to myself, yeah, this is working.
Mm-hmm.
It really evened me out.
Yep.
Problem is, I didn't like being evened out.
I had a good friend a long time ago. Lithium is usually prescribed for bipolar disorder. And I had a friend who would have really high highs and really low lows. She tried taking lithium. She felt evened out and she didn't like it. And she decided to sleep through the lows and live for the highs. And that worked at least for a little while. But a common report of people who are taking that particular drug is that they just feel flat. They don't feel up or down, and that's not really life. At the same time, if your disorder, if the difficulty is making your life difficult, it's worth trying something, you know. So I'm not going to speak negatively about all medication for all mental health. I think sometimes they're very useful, but.
But you're right, for me, I guess the feeling was, it's making me blank.
Yeah.
Emotionally blank.
It's a common
And
report.
my thought was, I would rather be depressed than blank.
Yeah, it's a common report. And I think what you're describing is an adult making a decision for themselves.
Well,
I like this better than that, you know?
okay.
I mean, that's good.
I don't know if it's good, but that's what happened.
Well, it makes sense to me anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. And thanks.
Thank you all.